Good afternoon, everyone. We are happy to have you join us for an exciting new look at Frederick Law Olmsted. Today's program is part of a series of public programs offered by the Olmsted Network to advance the work and principles of the Olmsted firm through advocacy, education, and stewardship. This is one of two programs, in fact, dedicated to the Olmsted Beal House or Tosomock Farm on Staten Island, as it was known to Frederick Law Olmsted. On July 20, we hosted a special in-person visit to the farm, and today we follow up with a more intensive look at the work of Frederick Law Olmsted on and off Staten Island. The Olmsted Network was honored to be among many parties who advocated successfully for the inclusion of the Olmsted Beal House on the National Register of Historic Places. We were also very pleased last year to present our President's Award to the Friends of Olmsted Beal for their tireless effort to protect and preserve this historic space. The Friends of Olmsted Beal House was created in 2018 by a group of concerned neighbors and former residents of Frederick Law Olmsted's house, located in the now heavily developed neighborhood of Eltingville, Staten Island. Although recognized as a historic landmark by the city of New York in 1967, the site has been largely forgotten, except by Olmsted historians, until the formation of this group. Within 5 years of its establishment, the Friends has grown to over 100 dues-paying members with a robust board. The house and its surrounding site are part of New York City parks, but they are not yet open. You can find out more about the Friends by going to our partner directory on the Olmsted Network website. We are delighted to have with us today Catherine Seavitt Nordenson, professor and chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania's Stuart Weitzman School of Design. There, she holds the Meyerson Chair of Urbanism. She is also the co-executive director of the Ian L. McHarg Center for Urbanism and Ecology. And her topic this evening will be Seeds, Grafts, and Offshoots, Frederick Law Olmsted on and off Staten Island. Her talk explores the seeds sown on Staten Island from 1848 to 1857 and the voyages that departed from and returned to this island that were critical to Olmsted's pursuit of what is now called landscape architecture. Catherine will present a program and then we'll open up to questions towards the end. Please feel free to put them in the chat box. So with that, Catherine, welcome. We look forward to your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Dee Dee. And thank you so much to the Olmsted Network for inviting me today. This is really fantastic. And what a wonderful introduction. I really wanted to just touch on that word ecology that showed up in the Ian McHarg Center subtitle, I would say. And something that I find really fascinating about that word is that if you take it back to its kind of 18th century, 19th century Greek origin, ecology, it means the household of nature. And we were speaking a little bit before the talk about this house. And so thinking about the house and the household and those who are within that house connected in all of these different ways. I see this as a really interesting way of reconsidering and learning more about Frederick Law Olmsted and his life on Staten Island. So thanks again for having me, and to Victoria for being here to help all of the tech in the background. I'm looking forward to sharing the work with you and talking about the house and fielding questions at the end. Really interested to hear what folks are thinking about, and hopefully maybe some of you were at that visit on July 20th. So I'm going to now share my screen. So give me just a moment here to pull up these slides. All right. Can you see that now in the full screen mode? Okay, great. So Seeds, Grafts, and Offshoots, Frederick Law Olmsted on and off Staten Island from 1848, 1857. Frederick Law Olmsted, who was born in 1822, dies in 1903, spent 10 years from the age of 25 to 35 on and off his 130-acre Tosomock Farm on Staten Island, with its extraordinary views of the Raritan Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. And as Dee Dee noted, we'll be looking today at the seeds that were sown at that farm and the voyages that left from and returned to the island that were critical to his pursuit of what we now call landscape architecture. Olmsted explored his identity on Staten Island as a farmer, a writer, and editor. But despite this focus on the land and the landscape, It's possible that what perhaps Olmsted most enjoyed was the farm's proximity to the watery realm of the sea. 5 years later, he had come to New York with the dream of becoming a sailor. Here I'm showing you an image of Central Park. So again, Olmsted is very much known for being the designer and the creator of Central Park together with Calvert Vaux. And I actually kind of came to the farmhouse on Staten Island obliquely through some research on one of the collaborators with Olmsted on the park. And you can see in this image, many of the folks who were part of that design. The photos taken in 1862. And if we count from left to right, the second person on the left, from the left, is George Waring Jr., who was in fact the drainage engineer of Central Park and rented the farmhouse, I think the barn behind the farmhouse in Staten Island from Frederick Law Olmsted just before he was hired to work on the drainage plan. So I've been doing some work into Waring's work on drainage and health, particularly at Central Park, but also in many other projects along his life and times. But it was interesting that this one figure of those who were together working on the park actually led me to Staten Island and to the farmhouse. So it's been a kind of circuitous route for me from this creation of Central Park, but also kind of thinking about it. Here you see the location of Central Park very lightly outlined in an orange sepia washed line of an image of the park before the park. And of course, the Greensward Plan from 1858, together with Frederick Law Olmsted, together with Calvert Vaux. This is the competition entry for the park. So again, this kind of comes at the very end of Olmsted's time on Staten Island. So here you see a picture of a very young Frederick Law Olmsted from 1850. He's 28 years old in this photo. So this is the time period that he's living on Staten Island. And then back to Ian McHarg, the former chair in the 1960s and onward at University of Pennsylvania, who wrote the groundbreaking work, Design with Nature, an aerial image from 1969 of Staten Island. And we can see more or less here the location of the farmhouse that is located on the south shore of Staten Island. This sketch, again, the red dot here is approximate location of the farmhouse, again, looking out on South Beach and Great Kill. So we're on an aerial view looking towards the lower bay of New York Harbor. So as a young man, we can see, and again, here's one more image. I like this one as well. We can really see this idea of the watery realm. This is 1911, so a later period, but you can see again, Staten Island, again, a very interesting view. I find the farmhouse would have been around this area of the south shore of Staten Island. We're looking northward towards Manhattan. You can see Central Park in this image, of course, the Hudson River, the East River, Brooklyn, Queens, and the Jersey shore here on the side. But again, this kind of context of the watery realm is a very interesting territory for Olmsted. Another map, now the north is to the right. And again, we're looking at the Great Kill here, the farmhouse, again, along this southern reach. And then a couple more images of what was the neighborhoods called Westfield and Southfield, where we can see here, Dr. Anderson is the name of the owner here, but the farmhouse is right here circled on this tiled together image here. This entire lot here was the lot that was part of the Olmsted farm. And again, you can see the neighbor here, Perkins, who will become, that family is actually the family of Olmsted's future wife. And here we're zooming in again, and you can actually see the farmhouse drawn into this image along the New York Bay. Into the Kills, a bit of that watery realm. As a young man, Olmsted also developed his interest through various authorial guises deployed in his earliest writings. He wrote under several pen names in these texts, aliases that reflected the lenses through which he would voice his written opinions. Wayfarer was the name he used for himself for his report on the walking tour of England and Liverpool's Birkenhead Park. You can see his signing off by Wayfarer here in The Horticulturist. This is an image of that park by Joseph Paxton in Liverpool, 1847. Very influential and has his budding ideas of Central Park and the public space for the citizens of a city. Yeoman is another alias that he uses in many of his early writings as a young man. Just an image of a yeoman here, but in fact, for Olmsted's New York Daily Times chronicles of his tours through the slaveholding agricultural states of the American South, he signs off again. These are anonymous articles sent to what is now the New York Times, but then the New York Daily Times, yeoman. And these descriptions where he's writing about the conditions in the South witness, very much an eyewitness to the enslavement of and agricultural practices that are taking place in a very different place from his experiences in the North. This, of course, results, this tour that's essentially looking through the American South will result in 3 volumes that are then developed into the book called The Cotton Kingdom, A Traveler's Observations on Cotton and Slavery in the American Slave States from 1861. He also uses another alias, an American farmer. He'll often sign out for that. He wrote about a utopian farming community in Texas. He sometimes signs his letters to his younger brother John as Agricola, which is a play on the word agricola, or the Latin word for farmer. So indeed, Olmsted's point of view as an author was that of a farmer as a young man, albeit he was a well-heeled gentleman farmer. And his ideas of the connection of the landscape and public health, evident in his later work, emerge from this view of farming. So on January 1st, 1848, Frederick Law Olmsted's father, John Olmsted, purchased a farm for his 26-year-old son on the southern shore of Staten Island, New York. It was the second such farm, the first being Sockham's Head Farm, which was a 70-acre farm on the southern coast of Connecticut. You can see it here on the top right of this map, near the family's home in Hartford, purchased by the elder Olmsted when his wayward son chose to try his hand as a scientific farmer. The much larger Staten Island farm, 130 acres, purchased from Samuel Ackerley and renamed by the Olmsteds as Tosomock Farm, would be the second farm abandoned along Olmsted's path to becoming a landscape architect, a path that entailed a detour into a writing career. Both farms were located on the Atlantic coast with views of the sea. Indeed, Olmsted's nautical prose appears in a letter to his brother John Hull Olmsted on March 4th, 1848, describing his dramatic voyage, moving both his furniture and his potatoes for the market from Connecticut to Staten Island via a 54-foot single-masted sailboat, the Juliet, very similar to the image that you see in this slide, from Sockham's Head to Tosomock Farm at Great Kills. He writes, "My sofa went lengthwise in her. The chests, chairs, etc. were in the staterooms. The sailboat sailed west along the Long Island Sound and south on the East River through the Narrows." And you can see his path moving by boat from Connecticut to Staten Island, encountering ice floes, he writes, and a snowstorm before arriving safely at Great Kills, where his possessions and potato harvest were unloaded. And again, here's a view of that entrance into the Great Kills Bay in Staten Island. The foundations of the Ackerley farmhouse, which we know today as the Olmsted Beale House, date from the 17th century, approximately 1685. Several early 20th century photographs reflect quite accurately how it would have appeared during Olmsted's time on the island in the 1840s and 1850s. One of Olmsted's earliest drawings is an undated sketch of the Staten Island farmhouse, probably circa 1849, but there's no context of the environ of the farm in the sketch. However, Olmsted has captured the distant viewshed of the steamers and sailing ships on the Raritan Bay. Let's look into that slide a little bit closer, as seen from his porch. In an 1848 letter to his friend Frederick Kingsbury, he wrote, "I do exceedingly enjoy the view. Sometimes it is wondrous beautiful. I'm sure you would like Staten Island," end quote. It's quite interesting for those who may have visited the townhouse to think about this view to the sea that was evident from the porch of the house. Of course, we can't capture that view today, but it must have been quite extraordinary to have that long view towards the Sound. Olmsted's time on Staten Island is remarkable, not so much for the landscape designs he initiated on the farm, which were informed by the most prominent landscape gardener of that time, Andrew Jackson Downing, who was born in 1815, dies in 1858, just at age 36. Sorry, 1852. But for the social connections he established there, which enabled him to enter the literary field. These relationships, in turn, led him to become a foundational figure in the history of landscape architecture in the United States. His neighbors on Staten Island included the publisher George Palmer Putnam, the poet William Cullen Bryant, and railroad tycoon William Henry Vanderbilt. Olmsted certainly worked the land, planted seeds, and grafted saplings, particularly pear trees for the nursery trade, at his Staten Island farm. But the substance of Olmsted's time on the island is to be found in the seeds sown in Olmsted himself to pursue first writing and then what eventually would be called the discipline and practice of landscape architecture. When Olmsted set sail for Staten Island in 1848, there was no identifiable profession called landscape architecture. The term itself was as embryonic as Olmsted was in his professional pursuits. One of the earliest known instances of the term landscape architecture in the English language appeared only 7 years prior in Scottish botanist and gardener J.C. Loudon's 1841 book, Landscape Gardening and Landscape Architecture of the late Humphrey Repton, Esquire, as follows. He writes, "These writings of Reverend William Gilpin and Mr. Uvidel Price are full of the most valuable instruction for the gardener relative to the general composition of landscape scenery and landscape architecture." And that's the first occurrence of that word. Repton, who's referred to in this, in fact, the book is about Repton, wrote an 1805 treatise called The Theory and Practice of Landscape Gardening. He was well known for his red books, which were portfolios. Here's actually a few images from his 1805 book, where he's actually kind of really looking at how trees should be planted, what kinds of scenes should be established, what is the shape and the pruning. But he's very well known for his red books, portfolios of garden plans, and before and after views of the country estates that he designed in England. And we'll look at a few of these. Here's Hatchlands. These were essentially calling cards in some ways to acquire new clients. So he would create these books of some of the projects that he had worked on, often showing, these are really fabulous books. He'll show an existing image. Here you can see this brick farmhouse and a gate and wall, and then a kind of before and after. You flap the page away and you can see that he's removed the foreground buildings and the wall and created this curving drive to the farmhouse itself, or to the estate house. So this is really thinking about these country estates. There was no truly articulated and autonomous profession of landscape architecture at that time, really just the exemplar of the profession of the landscape gardener, a term that Olmsted would later avoid, at that time was Andrew Jackson Downing in the United States. Olmsted not only knew Downing at that time through his writings, particularly the popular book, A Treatise on the Theory and Practice of Landscape Gardening, adapted to North America. This is from 1841. We can see, if we actually zoom into that beautiful image on the left side of the frontispiece of the book, this bucolic scene of a lawn in front of a country house with a woman and a child, kind of looking at the sort of gendered relationship of people and landscape, and through these trees that are foregrounded to the house, and then the long view as well. He writes, and this is a quote from typical sort of cadence of Andrew Jackson Downing's writing, "The lawn or park, which commands a view of surpassing beauty, is studded with groups of fine forest trees, beneath which are delightful walks leading in easy curves to rustic seats, summer houses, etc., disposed in secluded spots or to openings affording the most lovely prospects." So this is an incredibly popular book. In fact, it was not only I think, influential on Olmsted, certainly, but also Downing's journal, The Horticulturist. And in fact, Olmsted met Downing at his estate and nursery farm in Newburgh, a town along the Hudson River. Olmsted's approach to farming, particularly on Staten Island, would be influenced by Downing's philosophy on landscape gardening as articulated in the treatise. Downing's treatise was a primer on the English landscape aesthetic, ranking the so-called picturesque style as the ideal, given its elegance in composition, expression, and form, a practice of smoothing. He steered popular taste in landscape and gardening toward more natural, picturesque modes. Downing's treatise not only helped to popularize the landscape gardening and design, but also theorized it, making it a canonical text for the future profession. The influence of Downing and his landscape theory on Olmsted is manifold. First, Downing's writings, particularly in The Horticulturist, informed Olmsted's scientific approach to farming. Second, Downing's work inspired Olmsted to write. Downing even published some of Olmsted's earliest writings in The Horticulturist. Downing also wrote letters of introduction for Olmsted's trip to England in 1850. Here we can see, in fact, an advertisement from Andrew Jackson Downing's professional landscape gardening practice. Interesting to see some of these prices. The design for the grounds of a cottage residence at $30. But finally, in what is arguably the most significant introduction in the history of landscape architecture in the United States, Downing introduced Olmsted to Calvert Vaux, an English architect and draftsman, whom Downing brought to New York to work as his so-called pencil at his landscape gardening firm in Newburgh. Following Downing's death in a steamboat accident in 1852, Vaux would soon become Olmsted's most distinguished collaborator, helping develop the Greensward Plan for Central Park in 1857, and is the primary designer of Prospect Park in Brooklyn, among numerous other projects by the Olmsted-Vaux partnership. Shortly before Vaux's death in 1895, Olmsted credited his own identity and career as a landscape architect to his former partner, saying, quote, "I should have had nothing to do with the design of Central Park or of Prospect Park had not Vaux invited me to join him in those works. But for his invitation, I should not have been a landscape architect. I should have been a farmer, period." And end quote. So this is quite interesting to see this relationship growing through these relationships that grew out of his Staten Island days as a farmer, and the great importance of Calvert Vaux, in fact, the pencil. But all of this was yet to come for Olmsted. When he set for Staten Island in March of 1848, he knew Downing's work and had read his writings, but he was still searching for what would become his vocation. In terms of the physical design of Olmsted's farm on Staten Island, there are no drawings or other extant evidence of Olmsted's planning and management of the farm. He was a gentleman farmer trying to make a profitable business, but there's no indication that he was making physical drawings to lay out and operate the Staten Island farm. According to Charles Capon McLaughlin and Charles E. Beveridge, Olmsted applied Downing's theories of landscape gardening when laying out his farm on Staten Island, particularly noting that Olmsted took to heart Downing's plea that his fellow citizens should tastefully arrange and embellish their dwellings and property for both convenience and beauty. In terms of drawings and plans, Olmsted offered in a November 24, 1851 letter to the horticulturist a one-to-one sketch of a soldat laboureur pair. So we see, in fact, one of the earliest drawings published by Frederick Law Olmsted here of a pair. The crop that he imported from France and harvested as his primary investment at the Staten Island farm, influenced by Downing's other influential book, The Fruit and Fruit Trees of America, which was published in 1847. This was the third book of Andrew Jackson Downing. Even in Olmsted's circa 1849 sketch of the farmhouse, there's no context of the environ of the farm itself, but we know about this fruit. I'm going to rest on this image again for a moment. To get a sense of Olmsted's landscape work at the Staten Island farm, there are two documents that provide the most detail. These are text documents describing what was happening at the farm. The first is a late-in-life reminiscence by Olmsted's wife, Mary Cleveland Perkins, who, as you saw in the earlier plans, her family's property was a couple of lots to the west of Olmsted's. The second document is a recollection by Mr. Frederick Kingsbury, a friend of Olmsted's, which was recorded in 1903. Each of these recollections were published in the first compilation dedicated to Olmsted, entitled 40 Years of Landscape Architecture, Frederick Law Olmsted, Landscape Architect, 1822 to 1903, edited by his son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., and Theodora Kimball in 1922. Of course, I just want to point out we should really read such recollections with caution, particularly when offered decades after the time discussed and in such detail. So Mary Perkins writes in this description of the initial visit to the Ackerley farm by Olmsted and his father, John Olmsted, in the summer of 1847, which persuaded them to purchase the 130-acre farm for $12,000, the equivalent of approximately $435,000 today. She also detailed the physical conditions of the farm and noted Olmsted's approach to farming. According to Perkins, the approach to the farmhouse was through a stand of trees of fair size, oaks, maples, sweet and sour gum, sassafras, holly, etc. After crossing through this stand of trees, the land opened to a clearing atop a small rise in soil of heavy red clay suitable for wheat. The land sloped gently down to the beach, offering a view out to the sea and the New Jersey environs southward, Sandy Hook and Navesink, and all of the outward and inbound shipping. According to Perkins, there were no trees on this level with the exception of one tall old pear tree. This is in quotes. She describes a tall old pear tree at the foot of which were found from time to time the bones of the slaves who had been buried there, end quote. Notable here is not only the detail of a possible burial ground of enslaved people, but also the single pear tree that might have persuaded the gentleman farmer Olmsted to follow the precedent of the land in selecting pears as the primary crop of the farm's nursery. Perkins' recollection suggests as much, particularly in noting that Olmsted planted fruit trees as part of the development of a nursery, particularly pears, and she writes, quote, in a simple, inexpensive way, using the old buildings on the place and practicing rigid economy, end quote. Olmsted's own letters from 1850 indicate that he planned to plant 5,000 imported pear trees grafted onto quince trees as stock at the farm. That's the extent of Perkins' recollection of the Staten Island farm. Kingsbury, for his part, provided a detailed description of Olmsted's landscape improvements, as edited by Olmsted Jr. Kingsbury contrasts the initial appearance of the farm with Olmsted's improvements, which suggest Downing's influence. Kingsbury writes, quote, the house was simple yet picturesque. The barns were quite near, and in the rear of the house was a small pond, 15 or 20 feet in diameter, used for washing wagons, watering stock, and as a swimming place for dogs, ducks, and geese. There was no turf near it. The whole place was as dirty and disorderly as the most bucolic person could desire. It was on the surrounding of the house that Olmsted first showed his genius in landscape construction. He moved the barns and all their belongings behind a knoll. He brought the road in so that it approached the house by a graceful curve. He turfed the borders of the pond and planted water plants on its edge and shielded it from all contamination. Thus, with a few strokes and at small expense, he transformed the place from a very dirty, disagreeable farmyard to a gentleman's house, end quote. So this is really, that text is really the most direct evidence of Olmsted's landscape designs at the Staten Island farm. We can see similar precedents in the work of Humphrey Repton in some of the descriptions that we heard in Kingsbury's recollections, with the development of picturesque ponds as part of before and after country estate designs. Here's one, again, that flip-flap book where he shows a before and after of a country estate where a pond is being added, much like we hear in the descriptions of Olmsted's transformations of the Staten Island farm. The success of these improvements of Olmsted's Staten Island farm, just live to show here, we have some of these in our collection at University of Pennsylvania, the Red Books, and here's a view of one of those wonderful flip-flap books with students visiting. The improvements of the Staten Island farm can be inferred from one of his neighbors, the eventual railroad promoter William Henry Vanderbilt, who asked Olmsted to make such improvements to his own farm at New Dorp, Staten Island. Other indirect evidence of Olmsted's landscape improvements come in the form of cylindrical drainage tiling system that he installed at the farm, likely with the help of George Waring, who we saw on the bridge in Central Park in an earlier slide. This draining tile, the tiling system for drainage removed excess water from the soil by way of a network of tile pipes laid under the fields. This drainage tiling technique, which he had learned about in England, would be developed as part of his later work in Central Park with George Waring, who would also rent lodgings at the Staten Island farmhouse. Both men connected farming techniques to so-called sanitary strategies for achieving public health in an urban and public space context, which is quite interesting, this connection of farming to public space. In many ways, and here, in fact, is the map of the drainage system. This is executed by George Waring. The red lines are those same tile pipes, which he used at the Staten Island farm, laid into the ground at Central Park to sluice water away from the wettest parts of the park into a piped drainage system. In many ways, Olmsted's social connections on Staten Island proved to be more constructive than his agricultural endeavors on the farm. As noted, two of his neighbors were distinguished publishers and writers, the publisher George Palmer Putnam, who would encourage Olmsted to travel to England and compile his writings into a full book, and the newspaper editor and poet William Cullen Bryant, who, along with Downing, was one of the first to call for a large-scale urban park for the city of New York, and this would lead to the development of Central Park. When Olmsted's brother John Hull Olmsted and his friend Charles Loring Brace, who were also part of Olmsted's social circle on Staten Island during this time, planned to embark on a trip to England in 1850, Olmsted, envious of their wanderlust, wrote to his father and pleaded that he be allowed to abandon the Staten Island farm for most of that growing season. Olmsted suggested that his father, quote, reckon up the money lost by absence and compare it with the money value of my experience among English and Scottish farmers, end quote, thereby implying that he would learn from the trip and eventually apply such experience to the Staten Island farm. Olmsted's father granted permission, and Olmsted set off for England, a trip that would produce several of Olmsted's social writings, such as The People's Park at Birkenhead, near Liverpool, published under his pen name Wayfarer, by Downing in The Horticulturist in May of 1851. Here, Olmsted reflects on his impressions of this 120-acre public park designed by Joseph Paxton. The park had also impressed his future partner, Calvert Vaux. As you remember, he's an Englishman as well, and would influence their designs for both Central Park and later Prospect Park in Brooklyn. Upon his return stateside, Olmsted found support for his writings in none other than his neighbor, George Putnam, who encouraged Olmsted to develop his writings from England, from the English trip into the 2-volume Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England, published by Olmsted through Putnam in 1852. In that work, Olmsted again displays his interest in the nautical world, interestingly, with detailed descriptions of ships, but also describes various farming techniques, including the effectiveness of drainage tiles in an agricultural context. So we start to see some of these ideas connecting across space and time. With the success of that publication, Olmsted would embark that same year upon a literary journey that took him to the south and west of the United States, producing 3 major books in the span of 5 years, from 1852 to 1857. His attention during these 5 years was on writing, not farming, but it was through the lens of his early years of farming and wayfaring to and from the Staten Island Tosomock Farm that we find the origins of Olmsted's interconnected and complex ideas of public space and public health, later manifest and likely drawn by Vaux in the Greensward Plan for Central Park. You see the image here from 1858. And again, a look south towards Staten Island in the very far distance here across Central Park. And to conclude, I think it'd be interesting, again, I've shown some of these flip-flap images from Humphrey Repton. The before and after, even that idea from Repton's earlier red books, plays out in some of the competition entry drawings for the Greensward Plan by Olmsted and Vaux. This was submitted along with the larger plan that we looked at a couple slides earlier, but we see here before and afters, this time using photographs in the center here, with a very small title on their present outlines, and then below oval vignettes in watercolor of the effect proposed by Olmsted and Vaux of these particular views in this particular slide, number 5, taken from point E, We see again here closer up the present outline. So this is actually the image, an actual photographic image of what would become Central Park. And then these watercolor images that were made to indicate what they would imagine that to be like. So again, borrowing from these earlier techniques of Repton and others in the picturesque, some present outlines again, and we can see there in fact was farming at Central Park. You can see some of the stone walls there, the creation of a lake and the effect proposed in this slide. But again, I think the amazing thing about this house and the ecology of the house and those around and among Olmsted as a young man in his 20s and 30s, really striving to be, he thought a farmer, but maybe a writer, but then he actually kind of connects through all of these introductions and folks that he's meeting in the context of Staten Island to become a landscape architect. And with that, I will conclude the presentation for today, and really happy to take any questions that you might have. And my contact information, of course, at UPenn below if anyone would like to reach out. But I'll just end with that wonderful drawing of the pair by Frederick Law Olmsted. So thank you so much.
Well, Catherine, that was absolutely fascinating. And I want to encourage our audience to submit questions if you have them into our chat box. Let me start with one. Obviously, Downing had an immense impact on him. And this question is not original, but often asked. Had Downing lived, would we have known anything about Frederick Law Olmsted? Would he be the figure he is today? What's your thought on that?
That's a great question. I mean, I do think it was a lucky circumstantial condition, but I think it's a really curious question because he's met Calvert Vaux. Vaux is working for Downing. So certainly had Downing not died tragically in a steamboat accident at, I think, the age of 37 on the Hudson River, during this moment where they're beginning to initiate the idea for the competition for the design of the new Central Park for New York, certainly Downing would have entered, certainly Vaux would have drawn, right? Vaux was the pencil. So in some ways, Olmsted kind of slides into the void left by the death of Downing through that kind of already present relationship with Vaux. But it's such an amazing question, and one can only suppose, like, it's very curious. One doesn't, it's really quite, I wonder, I mean, I kind of feel like Olmsted knew how to navigate the social circles. And so I think that because he was already starting to think critically about, he's written about Birkenhead Park, very much the same spirit of what the plans for Central Park were kind of nascent and emerging with similar ideas of public space. He has this idea of public health that he's really drawing from some of the drainage techniques that he's learning about and implementing with George Waring on his own farm. Then again, these play out later in Central Park. But I wonder if he would have slipped in, just given the sort of milieu in which he was operating at that time. It's a great question. It might have been, he may have been in a different role, but his, I always find what's really fascinating about that question is also that Olmsted was not the pencil. Vaux was making those drawings. Olmsted is not an artistic person who's kind of creating those beautiful drawings, but he's working. He's like the voice. He's the front man. He's the narrator of the kind of the messaging. So he has a really critical role that probably would have come to the fore in some way. And maybe it would have been in part of that development of Central Park, or maybe not. We don't know. But it's a great question, but it would have been something radically different, or the relationships might have been radically different had Downing not died.
I'm also curious, it's good to hear you talk about Calvert Vaux. We just celebrated Olmsted's 200th in 2022, and this is the 200th for Vaux this year.
Yeah.
And again, there you credit Vaux, and Olmsted credits Vaux with really making him turn towards landscape architecture, despite his other desires and interests. Mm-hmm. And do you think that Vaux is not adequately credited today, given his engagement with Olmsted? How do you see that relationship? Obviously, it was up and down. They were often together. They sometimes came back together in Niagara Falls.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit about that relationship and what it produced that was great and what was difficult about it.
Yeah. You know, Olmsted really was a wayfarer. I feel like he had a kind of wanderlust. Like he goes to California, he's very much kind of moving around. I think we see it with him as a young man. So yes, there's the relationship for Central Park. They split and they come back together a couple of times. But yes, it's through Vaux that he actually starts to articulate a number of letters with Vaux to articulate the word landscape architect and the profession of landscape architecture as a particular kind of practice. So I almost feel like, Vaux is an interesting character. He may have been, I don't know too much about his, what he was like. I haven't dug into the writings or the archive as much for Vaux, but he does seem like he was the anchor of the partnership. And he stayed in New York. He was present. He continued to do what he did, which was to draw and to design public spaces. So I think that, yes, he is the underdog. I always try to use him in the same sentence when I talk about Central Park. It's Olmsted and Vaux, and to always include him because he is really the one that's kind of the powerful anchor that is allowing things to happen through the kind of hard work that needs to happen. And there's the other kind of politics and pressures and development. Like, of course, that would also need to happen. But it is really, it's quite, it's an interesting relationship and one that comes together and apart upon many touch points. But we should certainly acknowledge and celebrate him.
Yeah, we should indeed. In fact, and I'll talk about that a little bit before we depart this evening. We have another question. Has there been a cultural landscape report prepared for the farm? And if so, was there anything interesting or unexpected revealed in it?
I don't know if there is one. Do you know the answer, Dee Dee? I'm not sure if there has been.
I actually don't know either, and I'm hoping we have some friends of Olmsted Beale with us who can answer in the chat box, but if not, we will certainly find out. Obviously, there was quite a bit of work done in order to apply for the register. And that I think would suggest there's been some extensive research, but what that exactly fully said, I don't know. And if anyone does with us today, please let us know in the chat.
I think that, I landed on that image of the drawing of the farmhouse for some time to kind of talk about the textual evidence that we have describing what was in and what the site was like, what the farm was like. Of course, we know it's been really contracted to a much smaller footprint. It extended down to the beach, right? So there's a kind of long, linear landscape. I think that the notion of the pear tree and the potential of an African burial ground, right? That there might have been an enslaved person's burial ground on that very site is really, I think it shouldn't be taken lightly. Like, I really do think that should be investigated, but we don't know where and the extent of the farm property that was. On a less kind of powerful and poignant cultural moment, there was also this evidence of the clay piping for drainage. And so I think a cultural landscape report, I think sort of putting it in that context of the greater reach of the farm to kind of understand, where were these thousands of fruit trees intended? Where were they planted? Is there any remnant? Is there any kind of, I always kind of think that, soil is a kind of archive itself. And so is there something that still exists in our ground that is evidence of that cultural landscape of Olmsted's time and before and after? So it's quite an interesting question. I hope that it's really tricky to understand now that so much of the property that was continuous at one point has now been privatized and parceled in different ways. But it's quite an interesting and curious topic that I would love to see more research.
We have an answer, or at least a partial answer. Someone believes a cultural landscape report has been drafted but not finalized. And so that we will attempt to find out more, and perhaps we can even cover that topic in a future blog. Mm-hmm. And then we have a question: is there a plan to reconstitute the Olmsted landscape at the house? Catherine, I'll give that to you first, and then I'll try to add a little bit on that.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier to Dee Dee before the webinar began, I visited the house a little bit earlier this year, and there are historic trees which are from the period of Olmsted, certainly. So there is, it's hard to know. I don't know where the pond was. So we see a lot of description of like Kingsbury saying like he created this pond and created water plants around it. There was a circular drive, et cetera. So I don't know. I know that there's been some work done by Olmsted Beale that has actually redrawn the site and indicated where they think certain things are. And of course, the evidence of the actual trees on the site. The landscape. So this is interesting. So there's the planting he does to kind of create the gentleman farmer's appropriate farmhouse, right? Like a kind of landscaping of the grounds, but there's also the farm. And so I think there's kind of two things that are paired here is this question of like, is there a way of understanding what the farm planning was like? And is there any evidence or archive of that information? And then of course, like how did he create the sort of gardening or the approach to the house and the gardening around the pond, et cetera? What is your thought on this, Dee Dee?
Well, I was going to add, just as you did, that there certainly are some historic trees on the property. Osage orange comes to mind.
Yes.
In particular, and I know the Friends are quite proud of those trees to the extent that it appears they were planted by Olmsted or were certainly there at his time. Much more than that, I don't know, but I do want to recommend that those who are participating this evening take a look at the Friends of Olmsted Beale House website. There is an extensive amount of information there about what they have been doing, and you will see some wonderful maps and that will give you some insight into the island and the property itself. And so what we'll do is hope to have some follow-up from them on some of these questions that have been raised in the course of the webinar this evening. I'm particularly happy to hear you invoke downing and pears and all sorts of things and vox, because I'll make a little advertisement here. On September 13 through 15, the Olmsted Network will be sponsoring its national conference, and we will be going to Newburgh and Poughkeepsie.
Oh, nice.
And so we know that Downing's house is no longer there, but we may be able at least to drive by where it was. We will be visiting Springside, which you referenced in one of your slides. And we view this as a wonderful opportunity to celebrate the interrelationships, as you pointed out, of Olmsted, Vox, and Downing while we are in these communities. One of our planned visits is to Stonegate Farm, which is in Newburgh. This is a place that is operated by Matthew Benson, who is known as a great photographer. But interestingly, he has worked on bringing back some of the heritage pears. And so looking at that pear drawing is something we'll have to think about when we're there on September the 13th, in the hopes that we will be able to try a few of the heritage pears and get a sense of Olmsted's love of pear trees while we're there. Here's another question. Were there actual remains of enslaved people found on the property? This is a question in terms of what has been found out about the farm's past.
Yeah, the only evidence that I have of this is textual, and it's from the book 40 Years of Landscape Architecture, and it's a quote from Olmsted's wife, Mary Perkins, who describes, this is the quote, there were no trees. She's speaking about the lower part of the site, so I'm assuming closer to the beach. So this is again from the text. She writes, there were no trees on this level, with the exception of one tall old pear tree, at the foot of which were found from time to time the bones of the slaves who had been buried there. So there's no indication of when or exactly where, and I don't know if any remains had been found that were documented since this text document, which is written many years after. It's a recollection of Mary Perkins from her time on the farm. So yes, there were bones found, and the assumption was made that they were from enslaved peoples who had been working there in a previous time. So yeah, it's powerful.
Yeah, I think again, those are all very interesting questions that we'll make more work and homework for our friends at the Olmsted Beale Farm to let us know what they know. And of course, we also know that sometimes people's recollections are somewhat true, partially true, not true at all. We'll have to explore this to see what in fact is the case. Now, here's a comment. Interesting to hear the pen names change over time. And landscape architect, wherein he is rooted in Brookline. So would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I love this idea of the pen name. And I think it's actually common in the 19th century for folks to write under a different name. Right now, we're also obsessed with our authorship, right? Like, it's actually quite interesting to think about assuming a pen name. And he does this again, as the question is pointing out here, wayfarer. And we start to see, and again, I kind of see this in the spirit of Olmsted. He is a wanderer. He is moving around. He's curious. He feels he's almost like a very journalist mind in some ways. He's writing, reporting back. And we see this throughout his life. But yes, they change over time. I think there's Menhaden is in there at some point as well, which is another name that he used, a fishier one. Yeoman, of course, the small landed estate, the farming. So he's kind of seeing himself as this farmer. And I added in the chat there also, he writes to his brother and he signs off with a Greek ola. And it's a joke, like they're kind of joking amongst, agricola is the Latin word for farmer. So again, he's really identifying as a young man as a farmer. He's engaging in this. He's trying to convince his father his next farm is not going to fail, right? He really wants to be serious in some ways, yet he keeps wandering off in his wayfaring ways. And so it is interesting that the pen names that he selects for himself really do reflect his persona in many ways. And of course, landscape architect is the term that he and Vox come up with together. Is like, this is actually the work that we're doing. I would call it landscape architecture. So again, and I never thought about that as a kind of pen name as well, but indeed it's this idea of titling and assuming identity in many ways that is very writerly, right? It's a very kind of authorial positioning of one's personality and identity. So thank you so much for that question.
I'm curious along the same lines. I mean, George Washington loved to say that his primary role was as a farmer. And I'm wondering, could you address a little bit Olmsted and his use of landscape architecture as a way to address basically the democratic patrimony, if you will, at that time and the world in which he was operating?
Certainly, and Jefferson plays into this as well. I mean, Jefferson really saw the nation, the ideal nation was made up of these small farmers, right? That the yeoman farmer was in fact the heart of the country. So there is this this kind of idea of the working of the land is what produces a kind of good person, like that's sort of like in the myth, the mythos of the early days of the founding of the nation. So I think it is very much it's rooted in this. It's an elite estate holding male privilege. Let's be direct. Like, it is very much farming is seen as a kind of estate holding. And of course, this leads, as we know, to plantation economies and planter economies that are based on enslaved labor. And so I think that there is indeed in the kind of in the birth of the nation, like this embeddedness of farming as a practice that requires extraordinary amounts of labor that are then extracted from those who don't ask to be doing that work. And so I think there is something really interesting in the foundations here. And then we see Olmsted, interestingly, as a farmer, but he goes to study this condition, the economies of the Cotton Kingdom and the slaveholding Southern states. And so he's actually kind of looking at this relationship of farming and labor and work and land in really interesting ways. And of course, landscape architecture is the working of the land as well. And so many of the techniques that are learned through farming then are applied to public green spaces in many ways. And again, it's just, in some ways, it's another kind of farming. Many of the same issues that folks are dealing with and grappling with in the farm, how to drain the land, how to keep people from getting fevers from the miasmic exhumations of the earth, which are creating fevers. And so Olmsted is in fact writing about that in Central Park and has experimented with that with George Waring, who believes if you drain the land, you create healthier land, and then you won't have those fevers. So of course, they're kind of looking at this. What they don't understand is the mosquito, of course, but this is kind of thinking about like farming techniques as applied to public green spaces. There's a direct translation that's happening at this time in the late 19th century that's quite interesting.
And can you tell us a little bit more about George Waring? Because I think they worked together quite a bit. If I'm correct, the U.S. Capitol grounds had an immense amount of drainage. Talk a little bit about Olmsted, Waring, and drainage in the extended oeuvre by Olmsted.
Sure. Yeah. So there's Waring is a fascinating character. He actually kind of comes out of farming as well. He's from New York, Connecticut area as well. So very similar, a little bit younger than Olmsted. And Olmsted, he's working prior to Olmsted, I believe, with Egbert Veely on Central Park, who's looking at the drainage initially. So Waring kind of comes in as the apprentice in some ways, and he's starting to work on the drainage and think about what he's been doing in farm management. He actually worked with Horace Greeley on his farm, his gentleman farming estate in upstate New York. So again, there's a translation here from this farming and politics in some interesting ways into the Central Park. But Waring is interesting. The Civil War changes everything for everyone. Olmsted's off working on health, and Waring goes off to, I believe, to the Missouri Regiment. He's comes back as a colonel. So he then is looking again at, he extends this idea about drainage into health and to sewerage. So he starts to look at the sewerage of houses and towns. He's very important in the recovery and drainage plan for Memphis after the Great Yellow Fever epidemic of 1879. So he's actually kind of expanding this idea from farm to public park to cities in really interesting scalar ways. But again, starts to really think about this question of health that Olmsted is also thinking about. So I think, again, like this idea that public space can be a way of producing public health is one of the kind of fundamental tenets that's shared by both men.
We could go on all evening. I am sure this has been utterly fascinating. I want to say again, Catherine, thank you so much for joining us. And I want to do a shout out for 2 upcoming programs. On August 20th, 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we will have a webinar, Conversation with Olmsted, Exploring Olmsted Through Art. And we are delighted to have as our moderator, Ruth Frempson, the New York Times photographer who did the absolutely wonderful centerfold, if you will, about Olmsted on his birthday in 2022. She will be joined by Gary Hildebrand, Jane Leffler, as well as Anita Morrison-Matra from the Emerald Necklace Conservancy as we explore Olmsted as artists. Olmsted is inspiring art and activating art in Olmsted's parks. And then, as I said, our national conference, September 13 through 15, Landscapes of Renewal, Olmsted, Vaux, and Downing. If you have not registered, I hope all those of you on the call today will register and join us for 3 days of fascinating conversations about these 3 individuals and the opportunity to see the great spaces in the Hudson Valley. So with that, again, thank you so much, Catherine. We look forward to seeing you again. And as I say, we will try to pursue a number of these very interesting threads that we have initiated in this call and see if we can find out some more answers and some more information.
Wonderful.
So with that, thank you, everybody, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the talk today. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me. Good night, everyone.
Good night.